wanted to show you this. Thank you, ma'am. I'll pass it around. This is a picture of Jane taken, oh, maybe 20 years ago. But it shows you her character right off the bat. And she was a happy, low-key person in many ways. But I'm going to read a few notes. I don't usually read when I talk, but I just didn't want to miss a few things I wanted to tell you about her. My girls and I have one of my girls here. Raise your hand, Iona. Iona's from Princeton, and her kids are with her. And Iona and her sister and I lived in Buffalo for 13 years, and that's when Jane moved up to Toronto in that time frame. So it was right next door. We spent an awful lot of time with the Jacobs, and they were kind of the grandparents to my children, and so it was a wonderful experience to have them. Bob Jacobs is my uncle, my mother's brother. So Jane is his wife, and people say that I look like her and I act like her. Well, you can't help it when you're around a family that's, kind of on the edge and kind of bohemian, and that's the way we are, and it kind of spreads. What are you going to do? So I wanted to tell you a few things about her character, and as you see the picture, you can kind of see that as family. She was pretty irrepressible. When they moved to Toronto from Greenwich Village, New York, they renovated the house. It's a big 3-decker half house, so it's huge, big old house, and they put a garden on the roof, way up on the roof, so it's way up high, and it was a hydroponic garden. Does everybody know what that is? Okay, so in those days, which is back in the late 60s, a lot of green things were growing really well, and so some of the new neighbors where they were new, they thought, perhaps these New Yorkers are growing some things we would rather they didn't grow. So they called the police, the neighbors did, and they raided the garden, and they took them a long time to come back outside. The neighbors are kind of curious, and they came out after that with hands full of fresh vegetables and a very well educated about hydroponics. So that's typically. And another thing they did when they were new in the neighborhood, that first New Year's Eve, it was our family thing when we would go up there to go outside at New Year's Eve and bang pots and pans and just make a lot of noise. Well, I don't know if you know much about the kind of reserved Canadians, but that was shocking to them, and they would come out terrified and wonder what was going on. And the good news is that by the next year, they all came out with their pots and pans. You can't fight them, join them. So started a whole new tradition in the neighborhood. When Jane first moved to Toronto, she had been very involved in New York and stopping the big expressways through Washington Square and so on. Well, she couldn't just sit back when they were trying to build the Spadina Expressway through Toronto, and the whole area where the Spadina was planned to go was all marketplace area. And all these ethnic markets, which was fabulous, on the street markets, and just a bustling neighborhood. And they're going to rip this big thing through there. And of course, Jane said no. And she joined this coalition. And one time the girls and I were invited up, which we went frequently. And we had our own room there, the 3rd floor. And we're all coming in with our little bags. And she turned us around and said, "You'll have to find something to do for a few hours." So I had other friends in the city, so we went and hung out with them for a while and came back, tucked the girls in, and they came down and said, "What was going on? What was that about?" She says, "Well," she's kind of embarrassed. She said, "We did a little voodoo, and just wanted you to know that." I wasn't sure the girls knew what that was, but, we'll try anything to stop the expressway. So that was just not surprising to me at all. Never a dull moment with her, for sure. Jane was straightforward, would be a good way to put it. She was very straightforward. And she was Jane to everybody, including her own children. Everybody called her Jane. She was very warm and very inclusive, and I'm sure Iona can remember that. Iona's her name. She was the little one, but Jane was very cuddly and loved the children and didn't talk business when everybody was around her family. She had a very strong personality. As you can imagine, if you've read her books at all, she thinks a lot and then she puts it out there. So she had direct and thoughtful opinions, but I always called them statements. I felt that the family means of communication generally was called declarative sentences. So And I always thought they were facts, but that's not necessarily true. If you say something like it is a fact and no one questions you, but I'm kind of the right-brained conceptual one, so I had some adaptation to do from that. But they also needed me for certain things, so that was good too. She once said to me directly, she said to me, "You're an adult, don't explain yourself." So that was a big one for me, kind of knocked me over a little bit, but I've used it ever since. And my grandchildren are here, don't forget that. You're not quite adults, but hey. And then Amy, the older sister, who is out in Seattle, and Amy is very involved in the Seattle Walks for Jane, and she's doing all kinds of activities and seeing the film Citizen Jane tonight, in fact, so that's all good. But Jane, when she was 4, she would be at the table polishing silver with Jane for Thanksgiving or something. And Jane'd be sitting there with a cigarette hanging out of her mouth, polishing. Jane and Amy be up on her knees, polishing, and I overheard her say, "Jane, why do you suck on those things?" Meaning cigarettes. And Jane didn't even look at her. She just said, "Well, I've got a bad habit." Again, she didn't explain herself. She just talked in a declarative sentence. Yeah. One time I was in the dining room with my uncle reading the Sunday paper, and he was getting ready to go to yoga class. And she walked by us and she said, "Bob, I believe you have on my tights." And he never looked up from the paper. He said, "No, Jane, your tights have a strap upon the instep." Well, if he'd looked, he would have realized he had her tights on. But the cool thing about that, she never said a thing. No need to discuss these things. But Jane was a really good listener, and she was generally interested in anything that you wanted to do. She had, as you can see on the cake, and you can see in the picture I'm passing around, she had beautiful blue eyes, and she took in whatever was going on around her without interruption. She wanted to know. Concepts such as biomimicry, and she's written a book that involves a lot of comparison to how people should live with biomimicry, fascinated her, and she incorporated a variety of others' great ideas into what would make cities work better. She enthusiastically empowered folks around her, and endlessly curious, she encouraged us to travel or to try new things and report back to her, because I can always learn something new. So of course I had to travel and report and all. And Jane was not about fuss or fame. She wore jumpers like this. I'm dressed up like Jane today, which I bought in her honor today. For Jane was a comfortable, casual bohemian, and dressing up for her meant adding a pin to her jumper to go to the movies, or putting a scarf on when she went to see the Queen of the Netherlands to talk about urban planning. So that was it. No. Grandfather Jacobs always told us to argue ideas, not facts. Jane was all about ideas, great ideas. Her ideas mattered. She was all about exchanging ideas and action. Her ideas weren't complicated concepts. Her baseline ideas grew from listening, like you all do, and observing to see what was needed. They were all about what's best for the family and what's best for all your families, and commutable, walkable, community-centered neighborhoods. So all of you here who meet on the street and walk the talk are Jane's heroes and her legacy. So I want to thank you so much for all you're doing on behalf of the family. Thank you.